So if you don't mind, I'm going to stand beside the stand here. Otherwise, I'm going to look quite ridiculous limping around with my foot. Gloria, I want to thank you and the statistics team for inviting me today to share some of our, a very important part of our research agenda that is based on relying to increase our reliance on microeconomic data. Okay, so in that sense, I'm not going to talk about how to measure the digital economy. Rather, I'm going to talk about how trends of digitalization in the economy are allowing us to have available new data sets that allow us to measure the traditional economy in a way that is very useful when making decisions, such as monetary policy decisions that we do in the Central Bank of Chile. And the purpose of the talk is to convince you that a particular set of new data that is becoming available, this so-called electronic invoicing that is collected for tax accounting purposes, for VAT taxes, really has the potential of implying a data revolution when it comes to applied macroeconomic research. But to bring this point home, I guess I need to start from the situation we're in now. So let me first describe the traditional menu of data that central banks have at their disposal. There's a large sources of data that I could describe, but let me just focus on in terms of frequencies and start with the monthly frequency of data. So for example, this is the data that we're going to have available for us at the October monetary policy meeting. Okay? What are we going to have? We're going to have a couple of new releases of IMASEC. So actually one came out today, right? That's essentially supply side activity. We're going to have measures of the labor market, monthly frequency. We're going to have international trade measures. We're going to have inflation, very important, wages, measures of economic expectations, and so on. We also have data on a quarterly frequency, right? This, of course, comes with a longer lag, 3 months or more, that essentially measure the activity, but from the demand side. So they tell us a broader picture of who is actually demanding the goods and services that are being produced. This data is complemented by other data in quarterly frequencies, such as investment surveys that are very important to give us an idea where investment is leading to. And we also have information about firms which are required by law to list their balance sheet and tax statements on a quarterly basis. What is the problem with the current set of data that we have? I would classify these problems in 3 set of categories. The first one, allow me to call it the lag problem. It's quite simple. Most reliable activity indicators, like the national accounts, and information about the sectoral composition of demand, for example, whether investment is really being led by mining investment or non-mining investment. This information is available, if we're lucky, with a 3-month lag, and in some cases with a longer lag than this. A second and sort of related problem as well is what we call the aggregation problem. Under important structural changes that are taking place all the time in the economy, the use of aggregate statistics is not really well suited to distinguish new trends in the economy. And our failure to identify these new trends, in the end, translating what we call puzzles. Let me give you a few examples. The flattening of the Phillips curves. We don't understand why increasing economic activity in the US and other countries are not leading to higher inflation, for example. Related to this is the employment wage puzzle that we see in many countries. Or, for example, the fact that monetary policy is not really having a lot of traction in the current low-yield environment. What is going on in the economy? Well, I don't think that aggregate statistics of unemployment, industrial production are going to give us much hint. We really need to get into the finer details of what's going on within the firms. The third problem, this is a tricky one. I would call it the research tax problem. What do I mean by this? There is only so much you can squeeze out from aggregate macro data, from an academic research perspective. So let me put it in Spanish. Well, in English. You are not going to publish a paper today by exploiting models or data that uses unemployment, industrial production, inflation. That was okay in the 70s, it's not okay today. But this is the sort of tools and information that we have mostly available at central banks. So that means there is a tension. There is a tension between economic researchers that want to come out with interesting papers, cutting-edge techniques and methodologies, and the research that is possible at central banks when data is limited. Okay? That's what I call the research tax problem. And this is not only true for Chile. I mean, think about the Federal Reserve or other central banks. This is a very prevalent problem if you talk to economic researchers in these institutions. So what's our medium-term goal in this context? Our medium-term goal in the monetary policy division, but I should also say that this is a multi-division effort at the central bank, is essentially to change the menu of data, to change it towards increasing the reliance on microdata. And in today's presentation, I want to illustrate the potential of a particular set of data, the VIT-related data sets, for addressing these problems. Okay? I'm going to argue that the lag problem can be overcome to the extent that we use business-to-business transaction data that will become available in real time when we start using the electronic invoice. It can deal with the aggregation problem, because essentially this is information about every single transaction of every firm with every other firm in the economy. And I'll be more detailed about this. Okay? And for the same reasons, it can deal with the third problem, which is the research tax problem. I believe that the VAT data can bridge the gap between high-quality academic research and the analysis that is needed for monetary policy decisions. Okay? And this is especially true since the data that I'm going to describe to you can actually be merged with other data that captures other dimensions of the economy. So before I go to my examples, let me tell you a little bit about what this VAT data is. This VAT data is really, to be very specific, it's really three forms, okay, that we're using. The first is what we call the IRS calls it the F29. This is a time series of monthly frequency that is available for every single firm and records the monthly sales of the firm. And it also measures the purchases of some types of inputs. Importantly, capital expenditures. Okay? It doesn't give you any more detail. It doesn't tell who you're buying to or who you're selling from. Okay? But it does tell you what every firm did on aggregate during the month. So it's quite rich, the data. The second form is the F3323. We call it the purchase and sales book. This data has more details. It tells you what your net transactions with every single firm in the economy were at different frequencies. So if you go back to 2010 when this series became available, it's going to be every 6 months. So it's sort of an input-output matrix, but with a 6-month frequency for every firm. And then, I believe in 2013, around that time, it became monthly. Now, that was discontinued to produce the third form, and this is the one I want to focus the attention today as well, which is the electronic invoice. The electronic invoice starts in 2014, is applied gradually to different sizes of firms, and essentially requires every single firm to upload every single transaction in real time to the IRS. So let me say this again. Okay? It's every single transaction between every pair of firms in real time to the IRS. There is no other country in the world that I am aware of that has this information. I gave this talk at the OECD a couple of months ago. We discussed with the people from Denmark and the Netherlands, and they were quite surprised that we had this kind of data. I should be more specific, that the IRS has this kind of data. Okay? Let me give you details of what these transactions have. The first is they have IDs. They have IDs of the firm who is transacting, including industry classification and the physical address in most cases. It has the payment method. So it tells you whether you settle in cash or in credit, and it tells you when the credit is due. It tells you what transaction took place, what the type of transaction, whether this was input for production, a capital purchase, and so on. That's not really necessary because in point 4, you actually record what the transaction was. So we sold this goods or services. This is a description. The description is not standardized, so there's a little work to do there. And the final 2 points. There is unit price and quantity. So there is unit price and quantity. This is what makes this data set really unique. Most data sets around the world that I'm familiar with, and other economic researchers are familiar with, have P times Q, not P and Q. Okay, that makes a big difference. And just as a disclaimer, the IRS is very careful not to reveal the identity of the firms that they keep on the records, and therefore none of this information that we have in the bank has the actual identifiers. Okay, but we don't care about that. As long as we can track firms and we can classify them in sectors, that's good enough for us. Okay, so the rest of the talk I'm going to outline with some. I'm going to illustrate with a few examples how this sort of data can help us deal with each of the problems that I described. And I'm going to start with the lag problem, with a very timely question that we're debating in monetary policy meetings all the time. What is driving investment in the Chilean economy right now? I mean, right now, like this couple of months, leading to the October monetary policy meeting. This is important because not all types of investment, in terms of the sector that is actually undertaking the investment effort, has the same economic traction. Especially when you live in a country that has a commodity-based productive structure. In particular, mining investment does not have the same economic traction as overall investment in other sectors. For once, the mining investment is less linked to the business cycle, and as such is less reliable as an early indicator of macro turning points for the broader economy, but mostly because the expanded production capacity that comes about from the higher investment is going to be less labor intensive. Okay? Producing copper is not very labor intensive. So it is important to understand whether the larger production capacity being enabled by this investment will be of high labor intensiveness or low. Because that's going to translate into different implications for employment and inflation. Okay? But making the distinction in real time is not easy. And it's not easy because sectoral investment can only imperfectly be inferred from monthly activity data. And even at the quarterly frequency, if we wait for the national accounts, so say in the September monetary policy report, we had the information from June. And in that information, it tells you that you can separate investment into machinery and equipment and construction and other types of investment. But it doesn't tell you which sectors are demanding investment. Okay? So it's not that we don't do any analysis of it. We do. We use complementary data for that. But because it's complementary, some room for judgment still remains, and this is an area that can be improved. So in my next slide, I want to show you an example where we use the first form that I described to offer a new monthly frequency data set that actually measures a part of investment, not the whole investment in the economy, but that can assign it to different sectors. Okay? So to motivate this example, imagine that I didn't have the figure on the right, which I'm going to describe in a second. Okay? I only have the quarterly national accounts, and the only thing I observe in a monthly frequency is the IMASEC, the value added. So just to make a long story short, mining GDP is all over the place. Okay? It doesn't capture really any underlying economic trend. It's full of transitory shocks, like a strike in a mining complex, or maybe an accident in another one, or perhaps a stop in production that they have to do to undertake repairments and so on. So GDP in mining is not going to work for you if you want to predict what's going on with investment in mining. Okay? So now, this recently available data, the F29, if we put it together, and remember, this only captures expenditures in machinery and equipment. But this is what I'm showing in the picture in the right. And you can see that this measure actually captures the cycles of investment that we are well aware of now, that we have this that we have the national account data with the benefit of hindsight. So I guess my main point here is this sort of data does allow us now, in real time, to have a good proxy of where investment is actually taking place. Now, the next step in this dimension is to use the other data set that I mentioned, the last one, the electronic invoicing. Because in the electronic invoicing, I know not only whether mining companies are buying machinery and equipment, I also know how much money they're paying to companies that are in the business of constructing stuff or to sell IT services. That's actually going to be my next example. So in other words, with the electric invoicing, we can measure in real time the whole composition of investment in every single firm, and therefore in every single sector of the economy. Let me now go to the second problem, the aggregation problem. And I'm going to try to illustrate this issue with the following question. How deep have information technology services permeated into the overall Chilean economy? Okay? And for that, I'm going to use the following example. This is data for 2 years on that second form that I told you. This is the business-to-business summary of all the transactions that firm A undertook with firm B. Okay? And using that information, what we can do is to trace the performance of different subsets of the business service category. Okay? And what do we see between 2015 and 2017? We saw that these were not very good years in terms of, not very strong years in terms of economic growth. Investment on the aggregate was actually negative. But we do see one area where firms are really investing. And that's the blue line right there, the top one, which is information technology services. So information technology services more than doubled in the worst performing years for overall investment in the Chilean economy. This is a fact to keep in mind. But I guess the key question now is, how generalized is this expansion of the IT service sector across other sectors? I mean, is this basically reflecting the trends in one particular sector of the economy, like e-commerce? Or does it reflect a more general trend of cost consolidation and enhanced efficiency in most firms of the economy? So the answer to that question is quite important. Because if all firms are becoming more efficient, that is going to, or most firms are becoming more efficient, some of them, that's going to imply changes to the I/O structure of different industries, and definitely it's going to have implications for the transmission of shocks in terms of their inflation outcomes. So that's a question that we're really interested in the central bank. So let me give you a snapshot of what this network data looks like. Okay? So the red dot in the left-hand side graph is the IT service sector. And I'm showing you the circumference of that star are the sectors that have business with this IT sector. Okay? So in January 2015, remember this is monthly data, information technologies sold to 4 industries, and it bought from other 4 industries, and had bilateral flows with 3. Okay? So you wonder how central, how important is that, these numbers that I gave you? Not very central. Okay? If you look at what happened only 2 years afterwards, you see that the same IT service is now connected with more dots. Okay? So it's now selling to 11 industries and had bilateral flows with other 6 industries in the economy. A broader way of looking at it, and also more intuitive one, is to figure out how does information technology services look when we see the complete structure of the economy. So I'm going to show you one graph, which I think is quite interesting, and it's a measure of the degree of centralization, of centrality, I'm sorry, the degree of centrality of different industries. Okay? So again, January 2015, left-hand side, you see that the IT services, which is highlighted in the red dot there, is rather peripheral to the rest of the economy. Okay? So when an industry basically interacts with all other industries or with many industries, or maybe interacts with some industries which themselves interact with other industries, that's going to imply that that dot should be near the center of the figure. And that's exactly what happens 2 years afterwards. So 2 years afterwards, IT services is very close to the center of the economy. So answer to my previous questions, IT has more than doubled in those 2 years. Okay, I'm really anxious to see what the new data tells us for the current state of this. And more importantly, it became central. So basically every single firm, no, I shouldn't say every firm, most sectors in the economy are now becoming much more intensive in information technology services. So let me just offer a few questions for food for thought, maybe to discuss over the dinner. Did IT adopters substitute technology for labor? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe for some kind of workers. Maybe there's complementarity between high skill and information technology services and substitution for lower skills. That's an important question. And more importantly, it's a question that we can answer with this data. Did they manage to increase productivity and lower costs? Did this firm increase market share? What is the overall effect on market competition in different sectors? What are the consequences for medium-term inflationary pressures? These are all questions that are very relevant and can be now answered with data such as this one. The third matter that I wish to discuss is how the availability of such data relates to the third problem that I described, the research tax problem. So essentially what I'm going to do in my last slide today is to discuss a few examples of what I believe to be really hot research topics in terms of, to be very clear, if you manage to write a paper with along one of these lines that I'm going to describe, using this data, I think your chances of publishing this in a top journal are very high, very high. But more importantly, there is no distinction between the objective of that research and tools that monetary policy decision makers can use. Okay, these things need not be misaligned. Okay, so all the examples that I'm going to give you are examples that are very high on the priority, the research priority list for adopting monetary policy decisions, and at the same time are at the cutting edge of research today. So, first example, I alluded to this at the beginning. Prices and quantities can be observed separately, and not for a couple of supermarkets in the US. This is the whole Chilean economy. So these are all the formal firms in the economy. I want to stress that again, okay? This is not a random sample that you have to pay for. These are all the transactions in the economy between firms that are formally, that are in the formal sector. Most microdata sets observe sales, but they do not observe prices and quantities separately. And such a distinction is key to measure indicators such as market power, and more broadly to understand the pricing dynamics and other margins of adjustments in response to different shocks. Okay? And therefore, I think this is key to better anticipate inflationary pressures. The second line of topics that I want to bring to your attention have to do with investment. So let me pose two questions in economics that are quite important and very difficult to answer. What happens when there is a spike on uncertainty? How does that affect investment? Or what happens when there is a cut in the interest rate? How does that affect investment? Both very important, both very difficult. And the reason they're difficult is the same one for both. It's because we only have information for investment at a given frequency, most of the time at an aggregate basis, not firm to firm. And therefore we cannot do what, say, people working in financial economics do, which is they use the methodology of event studies. So they say, when Chairman Powell speaks, how do asset prices move, you know, around the day or the 2-day bracket where the meeting took place. We cannot do that with investment, but you can do it with this data, because this data has daily transactions. So of course, daily transactions, daily investment orders are going to be choppy, but these are all the firms in the economy. So you can identify a tweet of Donald Trump, and you can see how investment reacted that with a frequency of days. So I think this is quite a game changer in order to study this type of questions. The third line of projects that one could study with this, also exploiting the business-to-business structure, is to try to come up with indicators, early indicators of business cycle turning points. Okay, so what do I mean by this? Using the network structure of the economy, one can study how shocks propagate between firms and industries, and hopefully summarize some impending vulnerabilities in a manageable set of moments. So let me give you an example. I go back to the 2009 crisis, and we started studying this data around that period. And we find out that if you are able in real time to identify a couple of big firms that are facing trouble, you can trace the implications for the network of firms that are connected to the firm. Of course, in the frequency where monetary policy decisions are taken, that shows up with a big lag. and in an aggregate way. You don't see individual firms. But with this data, you can watch this, and you can see it with an arbitrary short lag. It could be a week, it could be a day. Finally, the physical location that is included in this electronic invoices can be quite useful to address a variety of questions in spatial economics. So I could have like a very long list on this. I'm just going to refer to ones that are more pressing for the statistics division and the monetary policy division. For example, you can construct regional national accounts. So what's the GDP of Coyhaique? I have no idea. Okay, we don't have good data of this. But you can track that from the information in the invoice. And not only that, again, it's a daily frequency. Now, you don't need the daily frequency, okay? But just in case, it's there, just if you want it, okay? Another sort of questions that you can explore with this. Local input and labor markets. I mean, do firms have monopoly power if they are located, say, in Talca, and there's only a few firms? Local labor markets. I think that's a very important question to address. Exposure to climate risks, a very hot topic. Hot topic, maybe that's not the correct word to use there. Anyway, summing up. Digitalization is drastically changing the set of tools that are available for applied macro research. I illustrate some examples using VAT data. They address three particular problems: the lag problem, the aggregation problem, and let me just stress again, the research tax problem. I think this awesome data that we have now facilitate recruiting and maintaining talent at institutions such as central banks. Thank you.